Students' perceptions about the effectiveness of learning process in Greek private tutoring centers. This is a presentation of a mainly quantitative research conducted with students of private tutoring organizations in Tripolis, Greece, concerning the factors that affect the effectiveness of the learning process in them. Purpose of research, among others, was to examine the effectiveness of the learning process in private tutoring centers through the views of their students in order to determine whether and how their operating mode in organizational, administrative, pedagogical and relational level affects their effectiveness. The phenomenon of private tutoring is expanding worldwide. The parallel extracurricular education has become a global phenomenon, and although showing different characteristics in different countries, the similarities are equally important. It has grown substantially in recent decades and it has increasingly developed into an autonomous system. It is clear that it develops, regardless of borders and cultures, different educational systems in East and West, between rich and poor countries alike, in an environment of creeping marketization and hidden privatization, according to Obrigado. The growth of tutoring centers in Greece and the drive of students towards the centers, especially during the last years of high school, is an undeniable reality. In the minds of students and their parents, school seems discredited. Private tutoring is considered to be necessary and essential if someone wants to have access to higher education. Many factors stimulate the shift towards private tutoring: the almost global crisis and devaluation of public school, the parental involvement in education in the modern context of globalization, even government initiatives such as the institution of additional teaching support in Greece, a form of formal public tutoring, the underfunding of public education, the centralized nature of the Greek educational system, thus ineffective and unable to meet the individual needs of the students, the extreme competition in university entrance exams, the expected benefits from tutoring for the tutees, social reasons, such as perceptions of Greek society for university education, or the long-standing relationship of the Greek family with the institution of tutoring, various psychological reasons. But if these factors stimulate the desire of young people for entrance into university education, why public school cannot effectively respond to the desire of students and of their families? Perhaps then the private tutoring centers exist because they meet the needs of modern Greek society that public school is unable to meet. So, what is the shortfall in public school, according to students? What organizational, pedagogical, interpersonal, relational factors determine the effectiveness of private tutoring? Despite the vast extent of the phenomenon and of the severe effects on social and economic level, on student performance, on the issue of equality of opportunity and or reproduction of social inequality, the shift towards supplementary educational support has not been investigated adequately. In Greece, the shift towards private tutoring centers has not been investigated thoroughly, apart from surveys with another object, and almost not at all through the opinions of students about what these educational institutions provide to them and the factors that influence the effectiveness of the learning process in them. The concept of the effectiveness in the educational process has been investigated solely for public educational units in Greek bibliography. This thesis contributes to the emergence of some factors related to the deficiencies of school to meet the educational needs of the community and relevant factors, organizational, administrative, pedagogical, relational, that affect the effectiveness of tutoring by recording the students' views. Through the detection of this poorly researched topic, issues for future investigation emerge. According to ELOT, public organization for certifying private or public institutions, Frontisterio is a government or private educational organization which, by implementing the institution of all-day school and or lifelong learning, works alongside, complementing and reinforcing the existing formal educational system, adapting its programs of study to the specific requirements of students and or their guardians, so as to be able to meet their special educational needs and fulfill their personal educational goals. According to the same technical specification of ELOT, Frontisterio of Secondary Education is an educational organization institutionalized and supervised by the Ministry of Education, whose operation and programs of study are related to supporting students of secondary education, to meeting their learning needs, improving their performance, to their educational and professional orientation, and to achieving their goals for a successful transition to the next level of education. In Greece, there are over 3,500 organized private tutoring centers depending on their subjects. A of foreign languages, B of other courses, especially maths, physics, chemistry, ancient and modern Greek, biology, economic courses, etc. In addition, there are private lessons, both in foreign languages and in other school subjects, which are mainly taught by public school teachers, unlawfully, teachers of tutoring centers, self-employed tutors, or even students who usually teach the lessons they study. Based on the levels of education, tutoring centers can be distinguished: A for the primary school, language tutoring dominates; B for high school, tutoring of other courses dominates. One of the most obvious questions, both for students and their families, as well as for governments, is whether after-school tutoring support is effective in the sense that it promotes cognitive achievements of students and increases their success in the exams. This question is particularly difficult to be answered clearly. As with other forms of education, a lot depends on the motivation and skills of trainers and trainees, the type of support provided, the pedagogical approaches followed, the intensity and the duration of the courses, the time at which tutoring is provided, the degree of adjustment of non-formal educational assistance to approaches followed in school. Various surveys in Greece and internationally show that students and their families generally trust private tuition, especially when preparing for the entrance examinations in university education. Satisfaction of tutoring in these surveys is high. Bray, however, notes that these findings may relate more to the perceptions of students and their families instead of reality. Various surveys in European countries have come up with conflicting results. It is indicative that in almost all surveys the researchers acknowledge the limitations of the research. From the findings of the research so far, however, it seems that it may be concluded that effectiveness in private tutoring centers is multifactorial and that not all forms of private tutoring support are effective. It is reasonable, however, to assume that in cases of comparative neglect and indifference of teachers in public school, students could ill afford not to attend private tuition that was specifically tailored for them. It is also reasonable to argue that flexible, student-centered learning formats, such as tutoring centers, which are constantly evaluated by the beneficiaries themselves, are more likely to be effective in meeting the educational aspirations of students than public school. The tutoring center, which does not benefit students, which is not efficient and effective in its programs of study and educational methods, is forced to shut down, simply because students and parents do not choose it. All researches internationally highlight the need for further investigation of the subject. In Greece specifically, the issue has not been adequately studied, and hopefully our research reveals some interesting aspects of it. But firstly, we need to discuss the ambiguous and multidimensional notion of effectiveness of educational organizations. In many researches, students and their families trust tutoring centers as they think they are more effective than public schools. It is important and interesting, therefore, to relate the appearance of private tutoring with the notion of effectiveness of educational institutions, an arguably multidimensional concept, but which is closely linked to improving the quality of educational work. Already in the 1920s, a trend was created that education can be perceived as an investment whose yield would be judged based on some economic terms. In the late 50s, the main criterion of effectiveness was considered the accessibility of all social groups in the higher educational levels, since the sovereign request of the time was equality of opportunity for all people in education. 20 years later, during the 70s, as a result of the economic crisis, it did not take long to see the first signs of dissatisfaction with public education. The educational systems were accused of being wasteful and bureaucratic mechanisms that serve the interests of their employees because they do not meet their customers' and economic development needs. Nowadays, the pressure of the past decades for efficiency, effectiveness, and equity of opportunity converts into the general demand for quality education in order to improve individual and social life. Regarding the analysis of education, the so-called institutional analysis has replaced the sociological one. Both the sociological and the so-called institutional analysis of education have been criticized for marginalizing forces which shape the educational reality and oversimplifications. The effectiveness of educational organizations, however, is still a difficult problem for researchers. There is consensus only at the point that educational organizations' effectiveness is a multidimensional concept. According to Hoy and Ferguson, an educational organization is effective when there is a match of objectives and outcomes. According to the model of systematic resources, effectiveness is the ability of the organization to acquire scarce and desired resources. Lastly, the two models were combined. The product of this combination is the combined model, which states that the effectiveness and quality of an organization depends on many factors and criteria. These refer to all aspects of the work of an organization: criteria for results, criteria for structures, criteria for the procedures. This latter definition was the basis of our research. From the research effort of the recent decades on the effectiveness of schools, there were no clear and generally accepted research data to explain clearly and convincingly the elements that distinguish an effective from an ineffective educational organization. However, factors emerged that play an important role in the effective operation of schools. The most commonly accepted ones are educational administration, leadership, high expectations, attitude of the educators, focus on teaching, student-centered character, school climate, measurement and evaluation of student performance, cooperation with parents. For the needs of our research, we categorized the school effectiveness factors to administrative organizational factors of effectiveness, pedagogical teaching factors, and relational factors. Starting from the administrative organizational factors of effectiveness, organization is an integral part of the process of administration, where leadership is one of the key factors. The process of administration of an educational unit, according to the classics of management thinking, involves four phases. Effective management starts from the right planning, beginning with clear and realistic goals. In Greece, inevitably, strategic planning of school units and tutoring centers is set by governments. Therefore, every educational unit can be effective only within the larger existing educational framework. In Greek reality, however, the schools, being in the lower stage of the administrative pyramid, are often paralyzingly limited by the state, which regulates every detail of school life, and effective administration's margins are minimal. Unlike schools, tutoring centers may be more specific and effective in their operational planning, as they may set more flexible targets, both protective, for example reductions for operating costs, and aggressive, such as the adoption of innovative methods of teaching or the purchase of modern teaching aids for better understanding of the curriculum. The next step after proper planning is the appropriate organization, defining the powers and duties of human resources, the appropriate use of financial resources, and logistics in the education organization. It is reasonable to assume that tutoring centers in this area may have some comparative advantages. Initially, in contrast to public schools directors who do not have this opportunity, tutoring centers managers ensure adequate staffing of their teaching unit, defining quality criteria in the selection of their teachers, as they are perhaps the most important resource in order to achieve their learning objectives. The qualifications, in the case of the teacher, are not only determined by the standard of academic proficiency, love for his or her work, willingness to constantly improve, real interest in students and social issues, the ability to cooperate, and are factors often taken into account, along with professional specialization in the process of hiring. Furthermore, the appropriate separation of uniform student performance classes is a process that is often planned by tutoring centers, which are organized with a view to achieving the best possible results, unlike schools. The next phase of effective management is the director's guidance so as to achieve the objective set. The effective manager ensures that there is proper utilization and management of all educational units' resources, satisfying the legitimate needs and desires of staff and students, avoiding missing lessons unnecessarily, establishing a good system of parents and school communication, scheduling the curriculum or the exams so as to satisfy mainly the students and not the teacher's needs are critical issues for effective management. Effective management therefore means balancing and harmonizing all the ingredients of an educational unit: logistics, organizational structure, people, culture, must interact positively with the intervention of the director. He or she composes the parts of the organization effectively so as to achieve the objective set. It is reasonable for someone to assume that in tutoring centers, managers, who tend to be owners, are more interested in it, as their survival depends on their effectiveness and their students' performance in the exams, unlike schools, where their effectiveness is judged mainly by the strict application of the central administration's directives. Finally, evaluation examines the extent that the various goals set during the planning phase were achieved or accomplished, causing positive or negative feedback. Unlike school, where evaluation of educational work progresses over hurdles, according to Miradakis, in private tutoring centers everything is evaluated, not only by their directors, but mostly by the beneficiaries themselves, the students and their families. Therefore, we need to investigate whether this occurs through students' assessments. Going on to the pedagogical factors of effectiveness, by common agreement among researchers, it is considered necessary for educational units to place emphasis on teaching, so as to improve academic performance of all students. Teaching is a planned process that naturally requires programming of the educational work and constant retesting. Ample time for teaching needs to be provided and wasting time must be avoided. Teachers need to communicate the goals of the course to students clearly and plan their learning process so that students continually feel the joy of success and discovery. In effective educational units, the bar of expectations is very high regarding the learning opportunities provided to their students, regardless of socioeconomic, cultural, and other differences among them. Specifically, teaching staff has a well-founded belief that all students are able to learn and tries to help them equally. Teachers provide what students need in order to meet their individual needs, help lagging students, and avoid any discrimination. For these reasons, optimism and high expectation in classrooms are evident. Teachers actively express their interest in the students' school success and are demanding towards their students because they believe in their students' capabilities. This belief in the student is able to transform him or her. This is the phenomenon of Pygmalion, or self-fulfilling prophecy, based on the configuration of the behavior of each individual and student in accordance to the behavior and expectations of others from him or her. Finally, efficient teachers have an ingrained faith that all students who attend their lessons will acquire some basic knowledge, and whatever the level may be, everyone will learn something. So we need to investigate how students perceive the attitude of teachers in tutoring centers at schools based on the above criteria. Principles and values that govern the educational organization are also important. According to Rutter, the ethos of schools affects the educational outcome of their students. We think that it needs to be investigated how students perceive the framework of principles and values that govern the educational organizations that they attend. Requiring students' achievement or good school performance is under the request of the pedagogical principle of individual student promotion. In this way, human school is implemented as dictated by the Constitution of Greece. The school performance assessment needs to include qualitative and quantitative criteria and different assessment methods. In each case, the product of the student's performance evaluation is utilized as feedback. We therefore need to record the students' perceptions whether they receive substantial feedback through a systematic evaluation of their efforts in private tutoring centers or schools. It has been argued and found by scientists, researchers, that the student is one of the key factors shaping the climate of an educational unit, which mostly affects its effectiveness. Consistent with this, in order for teaching to be effective, it should be more student-centered than curriculum-centered. Moreover, the students' needs and characteristics are to be met rather than teachers. Therefore, in an effective educational unit, students are placed in the center of the teaching process. In this process, the teacher's role, although vital, is transformed mainly into an auxiliary role, supportive and reinforcing. The teacher demonstrates practical support to any learning or other difficulties faced by the students, helps him or her to overcome fears and insecurities, and get additional knowledge, value, and special entity. Consequently, each training organization must benefit the students by involving him or her in the educational procedure and by reinforcing his or her own efforts, according to Milonas. So we need to investigate the extent to which students perceive that tutoring centers at school meet their needs and help them gain knowledge and skills. After many researches, school climate was found to play a crucial role in improving the educational project produced by every educational organization, since it is the identity of the educational unit which is shaped and influenced by organizational subsystems. The subsystems that affect the climate of the educational organizations are structure, size, external environment, and teachers' individual differences. The size of the organization is considered to be the most important factor in shaping the school climate. In small school units, the climate is more open than in large school units. It is reasonable for someone to assume that in the smaller classes of tutoring centers, closer relationships are formed among students and teachers, and that the climate is more pleasant. And this is definitely something that needs investigation. As far as structure is concerned, the higher the degree of work standardization, the more severe, threatening, and unpleasant is the atmosphere in the educational organization. The external environment, social, political, legal, economic, cultural, technological, also affects decisively the school climate. But mainly, in the training units, there are teachers with different characteristics: gender, age, education, years of service, ambition. In each case, the mood of teachers affects the climate. Therefore, it is interesting to be estimated through student size the teacher's willingness or favorable disposition towards teaching. Finally, as far as the relational factors are concerned, it is argued that the most basic and important ingredient of effective functioning is always communication within the educational unit that develops cooperative relationships and creates a mutually acceptable culture. This contributes to a climate conducive to open communication and constructive cooperation between the institution staff and the students. According to Milonas, there is a shift in the science of educational management, not just to the development of human relations, but also to achieving an organization's or school's objectives. In recent years, attention is turned to the effort to achieving the goals of the educational organization through the development of relationships. So we need to search through the views expressed by students to what extent the relationships developed in private tutoring centers at schools help them to achieve their goals. A key component that helps in creating a positive school climate is teachers' collaboration. The effective educational institution is primarily characterized by good organization and culture of cooperation with mutual help, support, confidence, and directness on a daily basis. The cooperation of the members of the teaching staff is essential to the development of the collegiate educational institution, while maintaining and developing cooperative behavior among students contributes greatly to the process of improving the effectiveness of educational units. For this reason, educational units must be a place of cooperation, communication, interaction, teamwork, and active participation. The study of George Bishop showed that in small school units, the climate is more open than in large schools. It is reasonable for someone to assume that in the smaller classes of tutoring centers, closer relationships among students and teachers are also formed, something which definitely needs investigation. Every school's or tutoring center's educational and cultural mission requires close collaboration between the organization and parents, guardians of the student in order to be achieved. Parents' eligibility for participation serves as a guarantee for an efficiently operating educational unit and contributes decisively to the development and improvement of cooperation and the achievement of the objectives that have been set by the educational organization and the family for the student. So we need to investigate how students perceive the information that their parents receive from tutoring centers and from school, and the degree that their parents' involvement as a result of this information helps in the intensification of their efforts and improvement of their performance. One of the main research questions, among others, was what are the views of students on educational, organizational, and relational factors that influence the effectiveness of the learning process in private tutoring centers. Through the literature review of existing research data, factors emerged that influence the effectiveness of the learning process in order to detect the way school and private tutoring centers respond to them. As part of our investigation, we have adapted this context of factors that emerged from the theoretical review in order to develop the necessary tool to record the views of students in tutoring centers regarding the factors that influence the effectiveness of the learning process in them. For this purpose, we used basically quantitative methodology with some quality elements. Given that the issue has not been studied in the context of the Greek reality, the use of quantitative methodology, using a questionnaire as a tool, appeared to be the most suitable for recording students' assessments. it could deliver data directly related to the research question of our research process, uniformly and consistently for all respondents. The evidence could be the basis for further research of qualitative nature in order to investigate the issue in greater depth. Apparently, bias was avoided as long as the problem of feedback in the behavior of the sample as a result of the active involvement of the researcher in interviews, whose position as a tutor was likely to affect the responses of the participants. We considered, however, necessary to include quality elements for a more in-depth investigation of students' assessments. The tool used for recording the assessments of students was a questionnaire which included closed questions in order to get quantifiable measurable data and open-ended ones as to allow respondents greater flexibility and opportunity to deepen their replies. To configure the tool, indications of the design of questionnaires and other tools that have been used in similar surveys in Greece and worldwide were taken into account. To draw conclusions about the perceptions of students concerning the criteria of private tutoring centers' response in their educational work and the factors of effectiveness that were set, the questionnaire sought to record the participants' views on the existence of the above criteria and factors in public schools and public additional teaching support in order to make a comparative evaluation. The questions of the proposed information collection tool correspond to the research questions formulated for our research, ensuring its validity. Various other actions were taken to ensure the reliability of the tool of our research. As reliability, we define the stability of the measurements. The findings should be similar if the survey is repeated to the same people under different circumstances or in a different sample of people coming from the same population. Given the size and nature of the sample, initially we tried to ensure it by actions relating to students expressing their true opinions. The questionnaires were administered by guaranteeing anonymity and confidentiality of participants, so as to ensure the expression of the real opinion. The questionnaires were administered in the classrooms of tutoring centers. Managers of private centers were asked to inform students of the research, its importance, and the possibility for the students to be informed of the research results in order to complete questionnaires with interest. So the response of students was, as expected, satisfactory. Also, the tutoring center of the researcher was excluded in order to avoid bias and the problem of feedback in the behavior of the sample. Thereby, we increase the chances that students in the sample have given their true opinion, and therefore our data are more reliable. As for the research tool, there was sufficient information on the way of answering the questions, clarity and lack of ambiguity in the wording of questions, double questions about the examination of some aspects, and even opposite directions of the positive and negative response in some questions, so as not students to be able to standardize answers and not to be any guidance or facilitation to students in choosing random answers. Thereby, we increased the possibilities that the responses were reliable. Checking the validity, the collected information is related to the phenomenon understanding and the research question that we posed. The questions are based on the research axis that were based on the literature review that preceded it. Many of these have been used in similar surveys research tools mentioned in the theoretical part in order to correlate the findings in the assessment of the results. For most questions, Likert scale were chosen as less prescriptive than selection and ranking questions, and as the most suitable for recording assessments. Furthermore, some open questions were considered necessary in order to reflect in greater depth the actual student's opinion or indicate some other factors not foreseen in the questionnaire, and to correlate the findings from closed and open questions. The combination of methods, triangulation, increases the likelihood that the data are valid. The population of the study were students of tutoring centers, class C of Lyceum. This is the last class of the secondary education in Greece. We chose this class because students' experience from tutoring centers and schools is the greatest in this class, and this is the class in which most of the students receive tutoring. The sample was students of tutoring centers, class C of Lyceum in Tripolis, all tutoring centers of Tripolis. The survey was conducted on March 2012. 130 questionnaires were served, 117 questionnaires were received, 2 questionnaires were removed because they were not fully completed, more than 3/4 were not completed, so the final sample was 115 questionnaires. The questionnaires' quantitative data were statistically processed using the programs SPSS and Excel. Students' responses were coded in the program SPSS, and tables were created with the values of responses and the percentage values for each variable. The data were correlated with each other and are presented in graphical form. The Excel program was mainly used for creating graphs. For the questionnaires' open questions responses, the method of content analysis was used. The responses were studied, similar repetitive patterns were identified, the categories were drafted, and then the responses were categorized and analyzed. For some categories, because of their high frequency in the responses of participants, statistics are also reported. Presenting the main findings of our research, we must say that for the pedagogical factors of effectiveness that we checked, most students agree that much more in private tutoring centers than in the school, there is emphasis on teaching, discrimination is avoided within the course and especially in assessment, an interest in the subject being taught is developed as long as a feeling of skills development and knowledge acquired as a result of the lesson, the educational needs or expectations of the student are sufficiently met, while students' performance is systematically evaluated with an incentive to improve it, and humanistic values are cultivated. Many students highlighted the attitude of teachers in tutoring centers, that they show interest, they have high expectations of them, and many others mentioned that the tutoring environment is more pleasant than that of the school, and the feeling that prevails, according to the estimates of the participants in private tutoring centers, is interest, while at school the prevailing feeling is boredom. Regarding the organizational factors of effectiveness, principally in private tutoring there were formed more homogeneous segments of students based on the performance level of the students. There is a more student-centered organization and lessons are not lost unnecessarily. Concerning the relational factors of effectiveness, closer educational relations are formed which lead to better educational outcomes. As we can see from the graph presented here, the primacy of private tutoring centers against school and additional educational support, concerning the students' perceptions about all the factors of effectiveness that we checked, is evident. The difference in the responses rates is significant, even if the questions were opposite directed. This applies to the pedagogic factors of effectiveness, to the organizational factors of effectiveness that we checked, and the relational factors of effectiveness. As we can see from all graphs, very few students have participated in the publicly provided additional educational support, and their assessments are mostly negative. Presenting the findings from the open-ended questions, we must say that they reinforce the findings from the closed questions. The dominant feelings when students are in private tutoring centers are interest, 73.04% of the total sample, 84.85% of the respondents, confidence, satisfaction, appetite for the lesson, responsibility, a sense of diligence and effort. Some students express negative feelings such as anxiety, a sense of needed obligation, pressure, fatigue, fear. Most feelings for school are negative, such as boredom, 65.62% of the total sample, 67.01% of the respondents, tiredness, frustration, disgust, resentment. Some students express positive feelings such as love, nostalgia, relaxation, serenity. For additional teaching support, there were only 8 replies. The positive feelings were interest and joy, whereas the negative feelings were boredom, indifference, cold climate. The findings of our study largely agree with the conclusions reached by Bray and related studies in Greece. The vast majority of students seem to consider necessary a private tutoring support. The lessons in which students of high school receive assistance are mainly these which are important for university entrance and are examined in country scale. These are the lessons presenting the greatest demand for after-school support and of the greatest intensity, greater number of tutoring hours weekly. Hence, success in the university entrance examination and the high competition in them seem to be the dominant forces leading to tutoring, as evidenced by the correlation of the respective closed and open responses. The degree of satisfaction of students from attending private tutoring centers in our research is also high, and most students believe that success in national university entrance exams is due mainly to private tutoring centers, confirming the findings of EICO and Bray. However, as mentioned by Bray, despite the high percentage rates, we should be wary of these findings, as mainly reflecting perceptions of students, and perhaps not the reality. According to the same assessments, however, the primacy of private tutoring centers against school in all factors of effectiveness that we tested is evident. In this area, there are not many relevant findings from other studies in Greece to be associated with our research, so as our research was small in rates and our sample was not representative, we cannot generalize our findings. The high rates, however, strongly indicate that according to estimates of students, private tutoring centers, for the efficiencies that we examined, operate more efficiently than school. This needs to be confirmed by other studies. The findings of our study seem to support the view expressed by many researchers, both internationally and locally, that the effort to extend free education for all, when unorganized and without appropriate conditions, creates a framework due to shortcomings and inefficiencies in the public educational system and the existing social inequalities for a parallel private tutoring system of school support in order to be maintained a minimum level of quality in education, as was also observed by Papanouchos since 1973, and in order for students to acquire the necessary skills in an increasingly demanding global context. The big problem that arises is that access to this kind of help can have only those who have the necessary financial means. The vast majority of students in our survey consider that attending private tutoring lessons is a major expense for their family. The majority of students in our sample believes that the economic situation of their family is moderate. It is significant that 22.6% of the participants characterize the economic situation of their family good, while only 1.7% of them bad. As also Sianou Kyrgiou and Bray mentioned, the nature and extent of private tutoring support is related to the economic situation of students' families, and that the tutoring centers are mainly the refuge of middle class. This creates legitimate questions about the role in the perpetuation of social inequalities against the disadvantaged who lack access to their services. The publicly provided additional educational support, as shown by the very limited recourse of the participants in it and the mostly negative judgments that were expressed about it, cannot encounter the social injustice, as also relevant findings from other studies show. On the other hand, according to the estimates of students of the sample about the factors that contribute to the effectiveness of tutoring centers, it can be reasonably argued that private tutoring centers enable students of the middle class to compete wealthier peers who rely primarily to expensive private lessons, promoting in this way social mobility. Certainly, this is an issue that needs more investigation. A good public school is a paramount requirement of the whole of Greek society. However, according to estimates of the students, public school is not responsive enough to this role. Therefore, studies are needed that demonstrate the weaknesses of school as they are recorded by the most important partners of the pedagogical process, the students and their teachers, in order to improve the efficiency and quality of education. Further research on the effectiveness of schools and private tutoring centers could be very useful for designers of educational programs, as they could, through comparative juxtaposition of the findings, lead to improvements in public schools, and they could demonstrate, as argued by Bray, what kind of education is required by the society. Generally, we think additional research is needed both quantitative and qualitative, in samples from both the general student population on a national scale and specific cases, in order to gather more data and through their association to draw safer conclusions. Internationally, tutoring is called to compensate for the weaknesses of the public schools in order to meet the demands of students and their families. According to its definition, Frontisterio contributes to the completion of the school substructure and focuses on the learning particularity of students by tailoring its programs of study to the specific requirements of students and or their guardians in order to meet their special educational needs and fulfill their personal educational goals. Until public education can respond effectively to this role and gain the trust of students and their families, as for example in Finland, the private tutoring centers in Greece seem to persist.